Australia is one of the most urbanised countries on earth, and most of us, 2/3 of us, live in major capital cities. Regional parts of Australia and rural parts of Australia are growing, but they're not growing with the same speed as urban parts of Australia, so it's likely that the percentage of people living in rural and regional Australia may shrink. And there's also quite disparate growth, so some parts of regional Australia are growing quite rapidly, other parts of Australia are shrinking. Now there's particular educational features of rural and regional Australia, and adult and community education plays a quite specific and important role in those communities. So the Australian Council of Social Services estimated that 18 of the 20 electorates in Australia where people have the lowest household incomes are in rural and regional Australia. And they also identified that there are some particular aspects of poverty in rural and regional Australia that are different to poverty in urban parts of the country. So the first is that people in rural and regional Australia don't have the same access to infrastructure that might assist them to build lives for themselves. They often have to travel further to access the services that people in other parts of Australia take for granted. There's some evidence that people can get stuck in areas with low-cost housing, so their low income leads them to move to a regional or rural area that has low-cost housing, but it also has low employment, so it's very hard for them to then get out again. Also, people in rural and regional Australia are much more affected by natural disasters like drought or floods or those type of things. There's also a significant population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders living in rural and regional Australia, and in some remote communities they're the majority community members. And so what that means is that the particular issues around disadvantage in rural and regional Australia are exacerbated, which has led to worse expectations for education and training and for health. So all of that creates a picture of quite specific disadvantage in rural and regional Australia. There's also some indicators of education and training disadvantage in rural and regional communities. Young people in those communities are about half as likely to access higher ed than their urban counterparts, although that has improved in the last few years, but they're much more likely to complete a vocational education and training qualification. In the school sector, we know that there is significant lag between the outcomes achieved in literacy and numeracy and scientific literacy between those in rural and regional areas and their urban counterparts. And in some instances, that expands to as much as 2 years behind their urban peers, which is really, really worrying. Now, adult and community education plays a particular role in regional and rural communities. It's often the only provider type for adults on the ground. Many communities that can't sustain a TAFE or a university campus will have an adult and community education provider. And what those providers do is offer programs to the general community, but they also form a platform for partnerships with TAFE and with higher education providers based in bigger communities. So they often work as a sort of a hub and spoke model to provide a platform from which people in those local communities, those small communities, can access higher ed and TAFE programs that are based elsewhere. And that role will increase over time as access to online systems improves in Australia. Of the 3 states that support a sector of adult and community education providers, so that's South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, in those states, about half of the providers are based in rural and regional areas. But even in those states and the other states and territories that don't support a sector of adult and community education providers, there's some evidence that small community-based learning organisations are very evident and prevalent in small rural and regional communities, and that they play a really important role in providing access to education in those communities, as well as providing community cohesion.